Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy.
Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're giving a warm welcome back to a repeat guest, Dr. Eric Helms. Eric, good to have you again.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It's always a pleasure to be back, Nick.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you. You know, I love talking to you. You probably don't know this, but I know way too much about you for your comfort, that is. I know
Just
about
mine.
Exactly, because I know where you live, I know about your wife, I know about a lot of your friends, I know what you do with your day, with regards to the trips that you go on and such. I think I know a lot more than you might think because I listen to your podcast appearances all the time. So yeah, just letting you know, I'm not like the host of Sigma Nutrition, Danny Lannon. At least I don't think I kill people that frequently.
That frequently. Well, that's good. 'Cause, I mean, his frequency is pretty high, so there's definitely levels to this. So I'm glad to hear that.
But jokes aside, it's great to have you back. And today, I actually want to talk about a nutrition-related topic because every time I've had you on, we've mainly talked about training, except for that podcast about surpluses for gaining muscle. Whereas today, I want to talk about protein because you have actually studied protein for a really long time, haven't you?
Yeah, my first entrance into empirical research was protein. So when I came out here to AUT in New Zealand, which I don't need to tell you where I live because you're probably outside of my house right now. Um, My master's thesis was actually on the topic of manipulating protein intake in athletes while dieting, with a specific focus on how that might apply to bodybuilding contexts and weight class restricted strength athletes. So yeah, my master's research, was making meal plans and trying to make shakes that were blinded. So we tried to control the taste and the flavor, and then we had a crossover trial of 2 weeks with people following the same meal plan, just different shakes on top of that to get them to different protein intakes and to see how that impacted their perception. So we looked at daily analysis of life demands of athletes, which is a validated questionnaire, the profile of mood states, which is another validated questionnaire, and then we looked at changes in mid-thigh pull, which is it's an isometric exercise that corresponds pretty strongly to overall body strength and especially like squat deadlift strength and surface anthropometry. So we looked at skin fold changes over that time period to see if a moderate versus a high protein intake differed between these lifters while they're doing their habitual training, with most of them being either combat athletes, strength athletes, and some off-season competitive physique athletes. So yeah, that's what I did, and then I wrote a systematic review about it, and that's been something I've been heavily interested in since, 2012 was when I started drafting that first review that was for my master's.
Yeah, I actually wanted to start with a story about you and your studies, actually, because the first topic I want to cover is protein intake and its relationship with muscle growth and retention. So I was wondering if you could tell us the story of how your own beliefs about protein intake and your understanding of the scientific literature have changed from that first foray into the protein literature with your master thesis, and you can weave in studies that have come out since up until the latest updated paper that you collaborated on with Dr. Eric Trexler and Dr. Martin Refalo.
Absolutely. No, I love a good story. And I think my lens of telling the story comes from, my experiences of what got me into research. So one of the big questions that people have had in the kind of evidence-based bodybuilding space is, why is there such a big discrepancy between what strength athletes and bodybuilders seem to believe is an appropriate protein intake versus what even the most, at the time, if we go back to, the mid 20 teens, even the most aggressive sports nutrition recommendations were. So if you were to look at a sports nutrition textbook from 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, and that kind of range, you're typically going to see a recommendation between 1.4 to say maybe 1.7 grams per kilogram for athletes, with maybe some differentiation to have a slightly higher intake for strength athletes, slightly lower intake for other types of athletes. And if you were to listen to, and this is still the case, a bodybuilder talk about what is a recommended intake of protein, or if you were to get on the proto social media of that era, or the kind of dying tail end of the magazines, you typically see recommendations between 1 to 2 grams per pound of intake, not 1 to at most 2 grams per kilogram. So for those who are not, Americans, that's 2.2 to 4.4 grams per kilogram of protein was not an uncommon recommendation. Now, some of this, I think, just came from the kind of more is better mentality, the traditional approach of following the anecdotes of others, and perhaps something that was maybe a lost in translation conversion when you've got kind of the quote unquote leaders in the bodybuilding space, which are often male IFBB pros, or at least that was the case in the open bodybuilding division, 10 to 12 years ago, who were in the off season are sometimes tipping the scales at 300 pounds or over 130 kilos, thinking more about what's their absolute intake that they're consuming, and then talking in seminars or on podcasts, but yeah, I eat 300 grams of protein, which is not extremely unreasonable when you're that big and on a crap ton of anabolic steroids, arguably that might enable you to grow faster and potentially benefit from a higher protein intake, but we have no research on that. And then someone who is, maybe a drug-free, serious but not bodybuilding interested lifter going, oh man, 300 grams of protein, is that what I got to do? It's like, well, you only weigh 175 pounds. But so another possibility, another hypothesis I had, because I started competing in bodybuilding in 2007 and was very serious about it, was, the times when bodybuilders notice, perhaps, when they're getting a benefit from these higher protein intakes might be when their bodies are changing the fastest, and when perhaps the demand for protein is the highest, potentially during the contest preparation phase. And something that had not really been interpolated in a lot of the reviews or research on protein into one kind of cohesive recommendation, or it was very rare, was various different circumstantial changes, or moderators, as we like to call them, that might impact how much protein you might benefit from. So a lot of the original protein research comes from population-based health. And there's a pretty large gap between the methods and what is appropriate, and even the outcomes, goals, and targets in sports nutrition versus public health nutrition. So when we talk about RDA, DRI, and other values that public health organizations can determine, they are looking at how do we give recommendations that minimize the likelihood in a large population of having nutrient deficiencies. And on the side of protein, one of the most common methods is what's called nitrogen balance. And nitrogen balance is a super fun method if you ever get the opportunity to do it. And I'm really glad I opted out of doing it for my master's, where you are collecting urine to actually see the loss of nitrogen. The reason why that's relevant is because nitrogen, out of the 3 macronutrients, is only present in protein. It's the only nitrogen-containing compound. So if you can estimate the amount of nitrogen in the diet, which you can do if you can have controlled feeding, and then you can estimate the amount leaving the body, you can determine whether or not someone is at, below, or above nitrogen balance. And that is a perfectly sufficient way for looking at overall non-tissue specific adequacy in protein. But there are substantial issues methodologically when you're trying to look at nitrogen retention in a nitrogen surplus. And there are known methodological issues where you really can't be using this to say, oh, a more positive nitrogen balance means a greater retention of protein and therefore greater muscle growth. And if you look at the turnover rates of different tissues in protein, they vary a lot. And muscle is probably not the one contributing to that highest level of turnover, even though it is the most abundant protein containing tissue in our body. But nitrogen balance is great. Don't get me wrong. If you want to figure out, hey, what's the least amount of protein we need in a population to have them not losing body protein? So our DRIs are 0.8 grams per kilogram or 1 gram per kilogram, depending upon which nation and body you're listening to. Or some of the studies early in the 90s, 80s, and 2000s on nitrogen balance in athletes, they're kind of saying, hey, based upon the activity demands of these athletes or individuals, here's the least amount of protein they need to not be losing nitrogen in net. But there are studies where they look at, say, muscle protein synthesis, longitudinal hypertrophy or body composition change, and nitrogen balance, and they don't always agree. You can see someone who's in nitrogen balance losing muscle. You can see someone in a positive muscle protein synthesis in acute measure and potentially not gaining muscle or even losing muscle. These things do pop up because these are all various different metrics. And nitrogen balance ultimately, as well as muscle protein synthesis acutely, they are proxy measures for the actual change that we're truly interested in. That's a lean body mass change, or even better would be some actual measure of hypertrophy, muscle cross-sectional area, volume, etc. So in the world of sports nutrition, there's a lot of holdovers from broader nutrition. So some of the recommendations were based upon nitrogen balance, and then they've slowly become more and more updated as we've had better ways of estimating the needs of people in different states and different levels of activity or different ages for protein. But even more importantly, they're based upon outcomes. So we now have a lot of studies that have looked at performance outcomes or body composition outcomes with protein. So back in 2012, 2013, when I was writing my literature review, which would eventually become the systematic review that speculated that perhaps in a dieting state, if you were lean and you were active lifting weights and doing cardio, that you might benefit from a higher protein intake as far as muscle retention or perhaps even gain while in a deficit. Since then, there's been far more research that's looked less at proxies and kind of made less interpolations between public health guidelines and sports nutrition, is focused purely on the applied research where we see actual outcomes. And there are numerous meta-analyses now that have looked at actually thousands of people, which is pretty cool, where we go, all right, let's look at resistance training outcomes like strength or changes in lean body mass, and then a continuous look at grams per kilogram of protein intake. The most notable, most recent meta-analysis on people lifting weights in a status of energy balance or surplus is by Nunez in 2022, and it's got, I think, if you look just at the resistance training studies included, it's over 2,500 participants across, I want to say, like 72 different study intervention groups, not individual studies, but actual intervention groups at different protein intakes. And they did meta-regression as well as categorical comparisons. And before that, probably the most well-known one was the Morton analysis that I was a part of back in 2018. But all the way back in 2013, what we really did not have was acknowledging all these different things. So each one of these factors are present in a competitive bodybuilder. They're not only just dieting, but they're also trying to get really lean. So they're going from lean to leaner. They're in an energy deficit. They're typically doing cardio and they're lifting weights. And when we look at any one of these individual factors, we see that they influence the way protein is metabolized in the body and potentially the importance of your intake relative to your body composition change. So when you look at total starvation, some really cool studies done back in the 90s, if you take someone with obesity or someone who is very lean and you don't feed them at all, you will see much higher utilization of amino acids for fuel through various pathways, leucine oxidation, gluconeogenesis, the liver converting amino acids into either glucose or ketones, and arguably probably maybe why you see much higher rates of lean mass losses when you take lean people and put them in energy deficit than you do when you put someone with obesity into an energy deficit. So just simply being lean means you have less endogenous stores or, opportunities to use other sources of fuel because you have adipose tissue. So you're probably going to rely on amino acids that are in your body already. Could you offset that with higher protein? That was one of my speculations. Another thing we see is that even though endurance athletes aren't trying to build muscle per se, because they have such a high protein turnover from the muscle damage and just the high utilization of total energy, in which a proportion of it does come from protein, even though it's not a main fuel source, they have higher protein requirements from that activity levels. And it's not uncommon for strength athletes while dieting or bodybuilders to do a fair amount of cardio. And of course, lifting weights is activity as well. But then on top of that, we see that when you do resistance training, and this is kind of where that fabled anabolic window comes from, you can benefit from a higher protein intake because it enables your body to use more of it to increase muscle protein synthesis and actually grow muscle. So it's not that strength athletes or bodybuilders have a higher protein requirement. It's that if you want to get the most benefit out of your training, a higher protein intake will enable your body to grow muscle at the rate that it would, quote unquote, like to. So each one of these factors comes into play. So I speculated, hey, in the systematic review, maybe this is a case for higher intakes. And to the credit of a few other people in the field, there were some reviews that had speculated about this that came out of Stu Phillips' lab, who's probably the most prolific sports nutrition protein researcher to date. And other people had definitely talked about activity, leanness, and resistance training. But I think I was probably the first to put them all together and be like, man, this might be a reason to have a higher protein intake. In an attempt to try to strengthen my rationale, I didn't just want to claim it and say, hey, this might be the case, therefore eat more. What I did was we did a systematic review where we had inclusion criteria where we could actually look at the studies that met that inclusion criteria. Is someone not overweight and not with obesity? Are they performing resistance training while in an energy deficit? And what do we see in those studies? And there were actually 6 studies only that met the inclusion criteria. And we didn't do a proper meta-analysis or meta-regression, but I did look at, okay, out of these studies, how many intervention groups were they? What were the different protein intakes? And then in which cases was there a non-significant loss of lean tissue, no change in lean tissue, or was there a non-significant or significant increase in lean tissue? And then what protein intakes did those groups consume? So this is more of kind of a qualitative, semi-quantitative assessment of those. And if you look at that systematic review from back in 2013, the recommendations seem very specific. I recommended 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass of daily protein intake as a loose recommendation of, hey, maybe this is the range you want to be in to preserve muscle mass. Now, like my own biases as a bodybuilder coming into this, I believed higher protein intakes were better. Everybody's doing it. It seems to be the case that it helps with muscle preservation, and it's all this rationale. I think many people interpreted that as, oh, Eric Helms just proved in his paper that higher protein intakes are better for lean mass retention. And here's the specific range, and he's got these studies. But I think the more accurate interpretation was I hypothesized that was the case, and that those were the protein intakes in the few studies we had that were associated with minimal lean mass losses or slight gain. But it was not a high enough quality of evidence to say, yeah, these are clearly the intakes that are going to prevent lean mass losses, and we've controlled for all the other various factors like sample size and all the heterogeneous aspects of these studies together. It was kind of more of your ad hoc kind of vote counting approach of just kind of looking at it, which I think was probably the best we could have done at that time. There were only 2 studies out of those 6 where they were experimentally looking at this question. 2 different groups, 2 different protein intakes, everything else matched. And what's the outcome variable of interest? Body composition. So that was where we were at that time. And various research came out after the fact. There were probably 5 or 6 published reviews and consensus statements that I were a part of, some of them, that kind of looked to that systematic review that I wrote and said, hey, probably a good idea to have a higher intake or trend towards these higher intakes in a deficit. And obviously, I wouldn't have written that paper if I didn't think that was probably the case. But I have always wanted to increase my certainty in that and give a more precise estimate and increase the quality of the evidence behind it and potentially see if maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we don't need to be that high. And I'm a fan of the lowest protein intake possible so long as it's optimizing things because it's expensive. Nobody really wants to be consuming a crap ton of protein. It tends to be satiating, which is sometimes helpful, sometimes not, depending upon how hard someone finds it to be in a surplus and grow. So sometime around mid 2023, I was in my contest prep. I remember I was doing cardio, and I texted Eric Trexler, who is one of my few friends who are excellent with statistics on more than just a conceptual level. I would say that I am pretty good at understanding the conceptual nature of statistics, but if you ask me to get into the R or anything more than SPSS and start running some stats, it's not my area of expertise, especially not for, say, meta-analysis. So I reached out to him and I said, I think we may have enough these days to do a proper meta-analysis on this, so we can actually get some quantitative, guidance on whether my hypothesis is true. Would you be interested in collaborating? And he basically said, neither one of us has any time for that. So when are we going to do that? And I said, I don't know. But a fortuitous thing happened. Strength and Conditioning Journal decided they wanted to do an issue specifically on bodybuilding. And they reached out, invitation, and said, hey, I think both to Martin Refalo, maybe even Eric Trexler as well, and myself, you guys interested in being a part of this issue? And Martin Refalo was just finishing his PhD around this time, also very talented with meta-analysis. He did some for his PhD. We've got a great working relationship. He's also a competitive bodybuilding coach, powerlifter, and just a really bright guy, and had a little more time on his hands than myself and Trexler. So we reached out and saw if he'd be willing to lead the paper while I would provide kind of that methodological, subject area matter expertise, and then Trex would mentor him through some of the more complex meta-analysis techniques. So we did that. Martin did the lion's share of the work on this, and we updated that original systematic review. We said, hey, everything published after the fact, we're going to apply the same inclusion criteria, update a few things, and we want to see if we can do a meta-analysis, a meta-regression, and see what's the story from a more quantitative perspective. So that's the story to walk you all the way through kind of my master's until where we are today. And now we're actually on the other side of it. That paper was published just a couple months ago, and we're doing our best we can to communicate the findings and put them in context, because it's still not the end all be all. This is still a relatively exploratory analysis in the grand scheme of things.
Thank you for that story. So I'm wondering, going back to your paper from 2013, you originally mentioned recommendations based on total body mass. And then in your paper, one of the changes that you made was to provide recommendations based on fat-free mass. I'm wondering why you made that decision.
This is one of those examples where peer review did its job. It really did a great job. So when we submitted this to the IJSNEM, that's the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism, one of the pieces of feedback we got from the peer reviewers was, this might be more useful since we're talking about people in a certain body composition state who probably are in sport or paying attention to body composition and have a relatively good idea of what their fat-free mass or lean body mass would be. And we think theoretically, the rationale for why you might want to have a higher protein intake is directly related to your lean body mass. Perhaps you should consider calculating this relative to lean body mass. And so in peer review, this is what we actually did. We went through and extracted that and converted everything to give those values per kilogram of lean body mass. And that ended up being something that was probably a little bit better when we actually did some quantitative work on that. In our most recent paper that I just mentioned that came out in Strength and Conditioning Journal, the Invited Review, we did analyses on both total body mass as well as units of fat-free mass. And we were able to look at the certainty related to the model fit. So we used the Bayesian technique of creating a meta-regression. And we created two different models, and to see which one had the best fit, how much of the credible interval was contained and how tight it was, and how much certainty we had. They were both really good fits, don't get me wrong, but we had slightly more certainty in the model that was based upon fat-free mass, which does make hypothetical sense. And I suspect it might even have been a better fit if we didn't have a relatively homogeneous or constrained body composition we were looking at, because we specifically were excluding people who were typically would be categorized as overweight or obesity. But yeah, I think this really is an important point where for like the trainers out there or the nutritionists who are working with someone who is trying to lose body fat, who has a relatively high body fat, they're typically going to have a pretty high body mass as well. And it's quite challenging if you are, let's say, 130 kilos or close to 300 pounds, and your goal weight is to lose 30 kilos or 60, 75 pounds to consume a really, really high protein intake like that. And it's probably not necessary. And that's quite the lifestyle change for a lot of people. So being able to say, listen, yeah, you're 130 kilos, but we're not going to give you 300 grams of protein. You're 130 kilos at 35% body fat. So let's actually look at your lean body mass, do that calculation. And oh my God, we just saved you 50 grams of protein that you need to eat per day. That's a much more reasonable, that's a whole, like one less steak per day, that you have to think about in terms of what does your day-to-day life look like, or a whole extra not double scoop protein shake type of deal. So anyway, that's I think an important aspect that enables the recommendations to be more individualized. The only downside to it is that some people really do under or overestimate their lean body mass, so it can give them perhaps a slightly less accurate view. But that is why I think it's important to understand this is like sports nutrition guidelines. This isn't the strength and conditioning journal, right? So we're thinking of strength and conditioning coaches, sports nutrition guidance, athletes who are probably getting access to these values rather than just, hey, RDs, this is what you should do.
That makes sense, and it is useful that in the most recent paper you did both fat-free mass and total body mass as well. So in this latest paper then, what were the findings? Were you right in 2013? Were you wrong? And how right or wrong were you?
That's a good question. And the answer, as I replug in my computer
Go ahead.
so that it doesn't die, is I had a few things right. And I think in some ways, it sort of doesn't matter how right or wrong I was. It's mostly important that the strength of the recommendations that are made matches the strength of the evidence. And if I could, it's easy. Hindsight's 2020, but I was probably a little too just straight to the recommendations. Like, hey, when if you read that paper, I'm like, hey, therefore we should probably consume this amount. And it was true that that was the best evidence we had at that time. A systematic review based upon 6 studies is not weak evidence. It's certainly better than kind of basing it on just your knowledge of the few RCTs that were out there. Like I said, there was only 2 in an energy deficit. So this gives us a better piece of information. But I think even though it is a systematic review of meta-analysis that are top of the evidence hierarchy, there are levels to even systematic reviews and meta-analyses. A poorly done meta-analysis can be pretty disastrous because it is the top of the evidence hierarchy. And if there's an egregious statistical error, we got a problem. Systematic reviews, they're much less likely to have a statistical error because there's no statistics. But at the same time, you are at the whims, if you will, of the interpretation of the authors. Now, because there's a systematic criteria for searching, for inclusion, there's peer review, and you have the PRISMA guidelines, the Cochrane handbook, you've got all that stuff. It really limits the likelihood that it's going to be a completely egregious interpretation. But it's always going to contain bias. That's the nature of being a human, right? So I think looking back, probably should have had more tentative language around that 2012, 2013 paper, but actually fully impressed in 2014. And what we have now is something that I think enables us to more confidently make those similar recommendations. So I think I was right in my guesses, but I was probably wrong in saying, and these are the guidelines at that stage. So this recent paper, the reason why I say it's still exploratory, but still stronger evidence, is that if you read our initially planned methods, we plan to do a meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is kind of a broad term. It just means analyzing a lot of data at once. But your traditional analysis in a meta-analysis is a categorical comparison in specific studies that are asking the same research question. So you would only have studies that were included in which two different protein intakes were experimentally compared to look at the outcome of lean mass, right? And then you would actually get your nice little forest plot where you can see each one of those intervention groups in those studies, and you can see, okay, in studies that had higher versus lower protein intakes, was there a significant effect or a meaningful effect, depending upon which uh, statistical model you used? Okay, here we go. We got our p-value, we got our confidence or credible interval, or we got our Bayes factor or what have you, or we're just reporting this effect size and the confidence interval. Take your statistical model pick, right? We said, hey, you know what? There's only, I think, 5 or 6 studies that meet that criteria. And we didn't feel it was responsible to do a traditional categorical comparison meta-analysis based upon that. That is done in our field. Should it be is a better question. And we felt in this case, based upon the evidence, that it was probably not appropriate. But you could still call what we did a meta-analysis because we did something called a meta-regression. Now, a regression you see all the time in papers. Anytime you see an R value reported, the relationship between two variables. You can do this in Excel. It's pretty easy. You could say, hey, what's the relationship between height and weight? And an R value gives a value between -1 to +1. -1 is two things are perfectly inversely related. As one goes up, the other one goes down in a proportional manner, and it assumes linearity. A 1 means they're perfectly linear related in a positive direction. Few things are perfectly related like that unless they are almost proxies for one another. A lot of things have strong relationships, though. The easiest one is height and weight. Of course, you can have two people of the same height who don't weigh the same amount, right? One person's higher in body fat, one person has higher bone density, one person lifts weights, the other person doesn't. One person's, you know, currently dieting and quite skinny and has a different stature, but they're the same, or different bone structure, but they're the same height, different weight. But you can also be pretty damn sure that if you looked at the population as a whole, as height goes up, so does weight. So I would anticipate, and I haven't actually done this, there's probably something like a 0.7 correlation between height and weight, right? That is technically a regression because you can actually create a line fit and use a mathematical equation to explain. I can predict the point on this slope or this line with this equation. If I know height, I can predict weight, that type of deal. Now, a meta-regression is when you do that with not just a bunch of individuals, but a bunch of different studies and their individual outcome groups. And there's a bunch of statistical modeling that you need to do with this, where you think about weighting based upon the sample size and the certainty in their effect and the variance of each individual study, making sure you don't double count. And you can do what's called a multiple regression. You can do this in an individual study, where you're essentially looking at the relationship when you're accounting for various variables going into the same relationship. So I want to know the relationship between height and weight when accounting for sex. I want to know the relationship between height and weight while accounting for ethnicity, et cetera, right? So what we did was technically a meta-analysis, but we didn't do your traditional categorical comparison. We did a meta-regression. So we looked at the relationship between protein intake, changes in lean mass, and then we did various sub-analyses. We tried to see which model fit was the best. You can do your traditional linear fit, but you can also use things like a cubic spline model, which is just a fancy way of saying we wanted to see if there was any bends in this. Because one thing that has been previously shown in other research is that there's probably diminishing returns in the relationship between protein and lean mass gains. I mentioned earlier that Nunes in 2022 is the most recent study that I'm aware of, meta-analysis, that looks at the largest amount of people in an energy balance or surplus, like over 2,500 people lifting weights. If you look at their meta-regression that they did, they had a linear relationship indicating, with relatively weak evidence, but still significant, that there is a trivial to small effect size of higher protein intakes result in greater lean mass gains when you're lifting weights. However, as the protein intakes get higher, you can also see in their graph that the uncertainty increases. So there's two different aspects to, or a few different aspects related to a meta-regression. There's going to be some measure of an effect size. Basically, how steep is that slope, right? How much of a positive effect of increasing protein is it going to have on lean mass? Then you're going to have some degree of confidence around it, which can be expressed in different ways. It might be a p-value, like it was in Nunez. It might be just reporting what the confidence interval or the credible interval is around that effect size. And if that effect size crosses 0, then we were really not sure. Like, okay, according to our statistics, we here's our average effect size that we think, but it could be negative, it could be positive. So really, we need more data. And when it's fully contained in the positive, it typically aligns with what we would describe as a quote unquote significant effect. Those are two ways of almost saying the same thing depending upon the statistical model. And then because you're looking at a slope, a line, and you have a different number of studies that are going to fall along that continuous line of different protein intakes, that uncertainty changes. So as we get into higher and higher protein intakes, we have fewer and fewer studies. So you'll see when you look at that graph by Nunez that there's uncertainty that's tight at the beginning, and then it starts to widen out, while the line still stays linear in the middle. And if you look at the bottom portion of their 95% confidence interval, which is a measure of uncertainty and it's visually represented, that bottom portion starts to curve and flatten out right around, say, like 2 grams per kilogram. So that's one of those first hints that we see of there might be some diminishing returns. It might be starting to plateau, and it might be at a certain point the marginal benefits are so small, but could be different with higher protein. Or sorry, more research on higher protein. Another thing you can see in that Nunez meta-analysis is they did some categorical sub-analyses. So they compared less than 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein a day to 1.2 to 1.59, and then to 1.6 and higher. And the effect size difference, the magnitude of the effect, the benefit you'll get for lean mass from going from below 1.2 to 1.2 to 5.9 is roughly twice the benefit you get from going from 1.2 to 1.59 to 1.6 or higher. Now, these categorical analyses, by definition, have fewer comparisons than that meta-regression looking at everything, but it still gives you kind of more of a hint of saying, oh, we're kind of seeing this flattening. So between that and also our Morton analysis, where we saw hints of what we would describe as a breakpoint, even though that wasn't technically a significant finding, and there are some issues with how we ran those stats back in 2018. We're all trying to get better. We wanted to look at some of these nonlinear model fits as well. But the cubic spline model and the other nonlinear models we tried to fit didn't fit as well as linear. So based upon the data we have right now, it seems that there's a linear relationship between protein intake and lean mass in a state of an energy deficit within the studies that we have and the intakes that we've measured. So this is actually something that surprised me. I was anticipating we'd start to see some type of flattening, diminishing returns. And the reason why that may not be the case is because the difference between being in an energy surplus and energy deficit is that there's a large portion of studies where you're still observing lean mass losses despite consuming a moderately high protein intake. So at low protein intakes, we found that on average, people in these studies are losing lean mass. At a relatively high protein intake, we see a point where we predict in our meta-regression where we'd see no change in lean mass. And then pretty cool that higher protein intakes, we start to see even slight gains. So the spread of the data when we looked at it was from 1 gram all the way up to 3.2 grams per kilogram when we looked at it per total body mass. And then it was, I think, from 1 all the way to 4.2 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. And the points at which you hit that point of no lean mass change was 1.9 grams per kilogram of total body mass and 2.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. So we found that pretty interesting. Another aspect that kind of gave some support to my initial hypotheses was we did several sub-analyses. Now, here's the thing. Sub-analyses, by nature, these are moderator analyses. Another way to look at it is you're not looking at the studies. So they have higher uncertainty, and they should be viewed even more exploratory because you don't have the full strength of the data set. And the full strength of our initial data set was 29 studies with like 750-ish people. So a small meta-regression, but still a substantial amount, and we had pretty good uncertainty values. So once we do one of these moderator analyses, we're automatically splitting that data up. So this should be seen as hypothesis generating at best, okay? But what we did was we categorized people as low, moderate, and higher in body fat. So this was under 12% for men or under 20% for women, between 20 to 27% for women, and between 12 to 20% for men, and then higher than 20 or 27% in men and women for our three categorical comparisons of low, moderate, and high body fat. And what we saw is that the lower the body fat, the steeper the slope, and the later the point at which your protein intake was high enough to prevent lean mass losses. So, meaning the leaner you are, the more likely you are to lose lean body mass, and the higher the protein intake might need to be to prevent it. So I think that's something that also indicates this is probably why an energy deficit, or one of the factors that leads to the benefit of potentially consuming a higher protein intake. Now, all of that's good, great. Everyone now, they're going to eat all the protein in the world, but I think it's really important to put into context how much of an effect we're looking at here. And in the grand scheme of things, if you were to say, hey, what do I need to do to not lose lean mass when I'm dieting, Eric? Protein is not going to be the first thing that comes out of my mouth. It's going to be, let me see the quality of your training program. Cool. That looks like a good one. That'll really help you make sure that you're giving a reason for your muscle to stick around, and maybe even improve if you've got some other things in place. Like, okay, Eric, what are those other things I need to have in place? High protein, right? No, we're not there yet. Next, let's talk about the deficit size, because a far more significant finding with a higher effect is the degree of energy deficit, the rate of weight loss. How much of an energy gap are you in? The whole reason we're losing muscle mass in the first place, and we're considering changing our protein intake, is because building muscle is the same way that we retain muscle. Muscle protein turnover is just muscle protein balance subtracted from muscle protein synthesis. Is it positive, we're going to be accumulating tissue. If it's negative, we're going to be losing it. And building muscle is an energy intensive process. It requires a lot of ATP. And we have a lot of different acute studies where we see that muscle protein synthesis is suppressed when you're in an acute energy deficit. And in lean people, it also seems that muscle protein breakdown is enhanced. It goes up, probably searching for more fuel sources like we talked about earlier. So to offset that, that's potentially where the benefit of being in this higher protein intake range is. And the better way to offset that is just not be in a deficit, right? But you have to be in a deficit if you want to have a successful fat loss phase. So then the next best thing is, well, let's set an appropriate deficit. Let's not do a protein modified fast. Let's figure out what's an appropriate size energy deficit. And, that's, it's kind of the intake, the rate of loss ranges that you'll hear recommended somewhere between 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week, lower if you're leaner and trying to get really, really lean, like closer to 0.5% and further from 1%. Those two things are going to have a far larger impact on your likelihood of retaining lean mass during a diet than protein intake. And then we can talk about optimizing protein. And the reason why I say that is because effect sizes, these are the way we describe the strength of an effect of an intervention. Everyone agrees that protein is a good thing. Higher protein diets are better for muscle mass gains or better for lean mass retention. We only slightly disagree as to what is high. What's the definition of high, right? And you can quibble over whether you think it's 1.6 or 2 grams per kilogram or 2.4 or 2.8 or 3 or what have you, depending upon energy deficit or surplus and how much you care about retaining every last milligram of tissue. But regardless, everyone's on the same page. But the thing is that if you actually looked at the data, we're looking at trivial to small effect sizes in almost every single case, even when we're comparing really low protein intakes by fitness standards to relatively high ones. And that is also what we saw. Going all the way from the lowest protein intake in our analysis of around 1 gram per kilogram, all the way up to the highest of around 3.2 grams per kilogram, the difference between the effect on lean mass was a small effect size. So that is something that you would probably notice over the course of the entire diet, but it's not like it would be like, oh my God, like I only consumed 1 gram per kilogram, my hamstrings fell off on Tuesday. Like that's not what's happening. So I think that is a really important piece of context because it tells you that you don't need to crush yourself to try to consume 3 grams per kilogram. You're going to get almost identical results consuming 2 grams per kilogram. And if you look at our actual quantitative results and then our practical recommendations, they don't perfectly line up. We don't tell everyone, since we had a linear relationship, to consume the highest measured protein intake in our research. We say, hey, what is the risk and what's the importance of losing lean body mass to you? So if you are a physique athlete you're at a relatively high risk because you're probably lean going to leaner. And as we saw in our moderator analysis, that's an that's an instance where a higher intake might be needed to prevent lean mass losses. And every bit of lean mass is going to matter because you're flexing in a speedo or a posing suit on stage, and that's literally your sport, right? So the risk is high, the importance is high. But let's say you're you're a serious lifter, but you're certainly not going to be getting on stage shredded, and you just want to drop 10 pounds over the summer, and you want to go from a moderately high body fat to a slightly more comfortable body fat for you. The risk is far lower. The importance is high though, so maybe you're not as concerned about the intake. And let's say that you're someone who's for the first time lifting weights, you have obesity. You've said, you know what, I really want to hire a trainer, hire a nutritionist, and I want to try to turn my life around, change this. And you're going to figure out how much protein you want to eat. You have a very low risk of losing lean mass, and your primary goal is not retaining every last pound of lean mass. It's being healthy and losing fat mass. And even just doing everything 70% right is going to be a huge improvement from you weren't even previously training. So the criticality of consuming the highest protein intake possible, it's not a big deal. And if you lost 90% fat mass and 10% lean mass, that would be a unmitigated success. Could it technically be better? Yes, but it doesn't matter. So that's an instance where you would be like, yeah, maybe shoot for the protein intakes where we don't see any loss of lean mass. Maybe your target should be 1.9 or say 2.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, that point where there's no lean mass losses. And then in that second category of, you don't have a high risk of losing lean mass, but you don't want to lose any. Maybe you're a power lifter cutting down a weight class, but you're still going to be reasonably lean in either case. You're not trying to get striated glutes in your singlet. Then it might be, okay, maybe my minimum intake is say 1.9 or 2.5, depending upon total or lean body mass. And then for that competitor or someone that's absolutely critical, you're looking for the whole range. I want to be within those targets, somewhere between, your 2 to 3 grams per kilogram of total body mass or your 2.5 to 4 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. And the reason why I think it's important to give a range is that flexibility is important. You don't want to create a diet where you're manipulating a variable that there's only a trivial difference in these minute changes across those. That whole higher range is a trivial difference, 1.9 to 3.2, because there's only a small difference if you look at the entire range of 1 to 3.2. So you're not going to notice the difference if you're at 2 or 3 throughout a diet. And you may notice the difference if your social life or your ability to be in the appropriate energy deficit, or how much time you spend agonizing over how to set up your diet, or if your digestion or your flatulence or something, or your dietary preferences are impacted because you're trying to consume a really high protein diet and hitting it within the gram every day. And that is a level of precision that is beyond the level of benefit. So you're making a poor trade, right? Just because something is technically better doesn't mean it's worth pursuing. Like if I was to go out to the Pacific Ocean and I was with you, Nick, and we were like, you know what, before we jump in this water, I want to actually have there be a little bit less water, so I'm less likely to drown. You're like, okay, how are we going to do that at the Pacific Ocean? I go, get out this teaspoon, take some out of the water, toss it, and I go, Nick, there's less water there. And you're like, yes, technically there is, but I don't think this is going to make a difference. I'm like, no, Nick, there's less water. Now we're safe to swim. And you're like, Eric, I'm not sure it works like that. That's kind of what a lot of people in our space do. It is technically true, but it absolutely doesn't matter. And we really have a tough time with that because we want to feel like we're optimizing every variable. But optimize, quote unquote, is kind of this myth we chase. It's not a definition we truly have. We don't even know if we're actually there. So it really comes down to what is the smallest worthwhile change that we care about. And we can sometimes actually use that exact metric and statistics. So in my mind, the difference across that whole recommended range for the people who really do have a high risk of losing lean mass and a high importance of not wanting to lose it, there may be no difference. And in fact, if we get more research in the future, it is possible that we might find a plateauing effect at higher protein intakes, and there may not be a real difference. I don't know that to be the case. The data currently doesn't tell me that's the case, but I'm very open to the possibility that it could be the case. And it does seem to be the case in a surplus. So I would actually hypothetically guess if you said, hey, Eric, you do 100 more studies on intakes above 2.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass per day in people in a deficit, Do you think we'd see a diminishing returns effect? And I'd say my bet would be yes. So that's where we're at, and that kind of contextualizes our recommendations. So these days, kind of what I say is, hey, if you're in a surplus, you probably want to be consuming somewhere in the range of 1.6-ish grams per kilogram as a minimum intake. And if you're in a deficit, you probably want to be consuming somewhere around 2 grams per kilogram per day as a minimum intake if we're going by total body mass. Higher, potentially better, but with probably with diminishing returns. Definitely in a surplus, I think we've got clear enough data to say that, and I don't see why it wouldn't be the case in a deficit, even though I don't have the data to back that up.
Excellent. That was super exhaustive, Eric, honestly. So, my understanding of what you're telling us is that, first of all, the effect of your protein intake on muscle mass retention or gain in a deficit is relatively trivial. You mentioned that your training program and its quality is the first and foremost variable, which makes sense to me because it is the trigger for muscle mass gain, and it's also what enables us to maintain it. And then the second variable that you mentioned was the deficit size, where there was a paper where they seem to suggest that up to 500 calories below maintenance, you might be able to retain muscle, perhaps even gain some. When you increase the deficit to above 500 calories below maintenance, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would start seeing muscle mass losses. And then you mentioned, and the third variable at that point becomes protein intake. So that already was great to contextualize the importance of these findings. And then based on the the first analysis that you did seem to find that there is, based on current data, a linear relationship in a deficit between protein intake and lean mass. You expected like diminishing returns, but that doesn't seem to pan out right now. We don't know about future studies with greater intakes. And then in one of the sub-analyses, you found that based on total body mass at 1.9 grams per kilogram, that's the point where muscle mass is maintained in a deficit. And above that, you might start to see some gains under certain conditions, which leads me to the final point in my summary, which is in the second sub-analysis, you found that the lower the body fat, the greater this point of protein intake where you maintain your muscle mass becomes, and therefore the point at which you can gain some size in a deficit becomes even greater. Is that a good summary of what you said, or is there anything that I misinterpreted?
No, no, no. That's a really solid summary, and just a few minor points is that the our main analysis, and actually our sub-analyses too, just simply give us a line on a graph. And that graph, if you can kind of visually think of it, dear listener, you've got your y-axis, and that's change in lean mass. You got your x-axis, and that's grams per kilogram of either total or lean body mass. And our main analyses were either to look at it through the lens of grams per kilogram of fat-free mass or grams per kilogram of total body mass. And those two main analyses are where we got the values of 1.9 and then 2.5 grams per kilogram of total and fat-free mass, respectively. And then we just simply looked at, okay, when we kind of quote unquote change the rules for which studies meet our inclusion criteria, how does it change the slope of that line? And we looked at differences in sex as well. We looked at differences in intervention length. We looked at differences in deficit size. And we also looked at differences in body fat. And we actually did find one other notable difference is that among women, the strength of this relationship weakened a bit. Now, a notable thing is that women made up about just under 40% of the sample. So this is one of those things I don't like to emphasize a whole lot because I'm not sure if that's the case. And I don't think there's a downside to consuming the protein intakes we recommended. And this could also be some interaction effect between differences in training experience, differences in body fat, which we tried to account for by having different categorizations of what is quote unquote low, medium, and high between men and women. But the strongest findings we had in our sub-analyses, where we had the least amount of uncertainty, was definitely the body fat analysis. And when you look at it, you can look at kind of the three panels side by side. the line just gets steeper as body fat goes down. And if you can visualize in your head, if you have a nearly flat line crossing another line, which represents the zero fat-free mass change, right? It's kind of like almost having two lines superimposed on each other. And then if you just tilt it a little bit, more of that line is touching the other line, meaning that there's this range where you could say there's probably no difference in fat-free mass. And that's what you see at high body fats. You have multiple points of this line intersecting, so indicating, man, even when you're in a really low protein intake, you're not seeing much of a loss of fat-free mass. And when you're in a really high protein intake, you're not seeing a whole lot of gain either. It's just it's not changing much because we have all these endogenous fuel stores, is what we think. And then when you do that with high body fat, the point of intersection starts moving to the right at a higher protein intake. And then the whole line is downshifted a little bit. So at a very high protein intake, you're starting to not see loss of fat-free mass, and you can maybe get some benefit if you're at a relatively high protein intake. I think so. So that's just kind of a little bit of context there. The most certain of our moderator analyses probably was the body fat one, but we definitely did see a effect of intervention length as well, which kind of again, you're cutting out a lot of studies when you do this. You go, oh, we're only going to look at studies that are 4 weeks or longer, but we did see findings that were stronger when we looked at 4 weeks or longer. And I think the way to contextualize that sub-analysis is it tells us that we're probably not looking at transient shifts in water that could be confused on a DEXA scan as a change in fat-free mass, which does sometimes happen. When you're looking at periods of 1 to 2 weeks, you're seeing a lot of changes in tissue hydration, which can lead to in a 2-compartment model or a 3-compartment model, depending upon your body composition analysis technique, something that is masquerading as a true fat mass or fat-free mass change. But when you're looking at a 4-week-long intervention, now some of those things have the magnitudes of change are different enough. You're not in that acute period, and you're actually probably seeing real body composition change. So the fact that we saw stronger findings in our sub-analysis of longer than 4 weeks gives me confidence that this is a real thing that's being observed, that higher protein intakes are helping preserve lean mass. And like I said, there may be some kind of sex difference here, or what might appear as a sex difference. There are slightly different substrate metabolization rates of protein between men and women that could just be due to body fat percentage. So it's tough to say. And if there's differences in activity levels that are systematically biased towards one of the two sexes, then that could be influencing that as well. So whether it's a quote unquote true sex difference per se, we can't tell that from our data. But yeah, we did see that the effect is a little bit stronger in men. And an interesting side comment, and these weren't included in our analysis because we didn't include case series or case studies. But when you look at a lot of the case studies and case series on physique athletes dieting, much more consistently you see retention of lean mass in women, which is interesting. So that may just because men have more of it to lose. And that is some kind of evolutionary biology thing of going, you know what? You only need so much to hunt. You spear chucking dumb male, like that's all right. You can still throw it, kind of that I don't know if that's the case. This is me obviously not having a PhD in evolutionary biology, but I could see why it would be beneficial for our species for males who generally carry more lean mass to say, we can give a little bit of that when we're in this starvation state. And that's okay, even though it may not be okay with us bodybuilders. We don't get to choose what our ancestral history has led us to genetically, right? So anyway, that could be part of it. But I think it would be really interesting just to do, future study on those sex differences and future study on those body composition differences as well. So we're not relying on a relatively small pool of studies that we're comparing to tease out these moderators.
I agree, and I find that particular finding quite fascinating. However, since we are running out of time, in closing, I have a final question that takes us back to the beginning when you were talking about the moderators that have an impact on protein intake and its relationship with lean mass. And you mentioned energy deficits or energy balance, and then cardio, lifting weights, and leanness. Now, what I found interesting is that you didn't mention protein frequency, protein timing, or protein quality. So I'm wondering, What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, they probably play some type of role. When you do a meta-regression or you do moderator analyses, you technically can throw as many variables into the model as you want. But you do have to be careful with what's called model overfitting, and you still want to go with what's described as the most parsimonious or harmonious way of looking at the data. You want the simplest model that still has the best fit. So our simple linear model that didn't include a lot of the covariates that we looked at in our sub-analysis moderator analysis actually had the best fit. So if someone wants to download our supplementary data, they can see how we tried to fit a lot more of these a priori questions that we set out in the front end. Hey, we think these factors might influence it. All of those moderator analyses, all those sub-analyses that we did were attempted to be fit into the main model, but they didn't improve the model fit. So we didn't go with them. And that's what is arguably the best statistical practice. So while this isn't directly related to protein timing, quality, or frequency, it's really important to point out again that this is a small effect. And what that means is that a lot of other variables are explaining the relationship in lean mass changes while dieting. And in fact, if you were to look at some of the text that we included in our results, we tried to give an actual percentage, how much of our model, or how much of the change in lean mass related to protein intake is explained by our model. How much of this variable actually predicts that? Like, yes, we can see the relationship, but how much of that relationship is explained by the specific independent variable that we care about, manipulating protein intake? And about 55% of the relationship was explained by the model, but 80 to 85% of that 50% was unrelated to protein. It had to do with what we call study heterogeneity. And the biggest heterogeneity that we saw between these studies was that the training, which we wanted to look at, okay, we want to look at the effect of training volume, exercises. We wanted to extrapolate training data because like I told you, if you come to me in a practical setting and you want to know what's the best way to maintain lean mass, I want to look at your training program first before we talk about anything else. So that's kind of the lens that we took as practitioners through this, is we want to take a look at extracting some of their training data and put that into the model and do some moderator analyses there. And we couldn't, because a large proportion of the studies did not have guided supervised training. And even the ones that didn't do a great job of reporting that training variable, those training variables. So I would say that the timing, the frequency, the quality, and more importantly, probably, just because we know from different individual studies of what has the largest effect on lean mass retention, the training variables, all of that is probably explaining much more of the change in lean mass than protein intake alone. And if you kind of do the math of, okay, what is 85% of 55%, protein is probably only explaining around at most 10% of the change in lean mass when you're dieting. With everything else, from your environment to your genetics to your how lean you're trying to get, to how much sleep you're getting, recovery, training, all that stuff dictating 90% or more of your change in lean mass when dieting. So to your point, these are all things that I would love to look at. But the reality is that the more types of variables that you plug into an analysis, the more you're kind of forced to make statistical concessions. It's very difficult to look at the interacting effects. So for example, if you wanted to know the independent effect of protein quality versus protein timing, we would of course have to cut out a bunch of studies that don't give us that data. And now we're going, okay, I think I can spit out some numbers as to the impact of protein timing and quality and their interaction while holding constant the effective dose. But I'm making that assumption now not based on 750-ish people, but on 150-ish people or less. And there's still a bunch of heterogeneity between studies. So this is the kind of thing where we would probably need a future separate meta-regression that tried to look at the independent effect of protein timing, quality, or frequency. Because now you can have a larger umbrella of studies that you look at, but then you have to accept the other realities. Okay, but now we're saying that the dose is not included. So we need more research is almost always the bullshit answer that us researchers give. But there is a good reason for that. And the meta science is enabling us to give better recommendations, especially when we're dealing with noisy measurements, small changes, trained individuals, and things that take a while to actually eventuate into meaningful differences. To be able to capture that, we can give these recommendations. If we were, 10 years ago, we were probably giving slightly lower than optimal protein intakes because we couldn't capture a trivial difference. And then you could say, well, so what though? It's only a trivial difference. And I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. Like manipulating protein frequency after you're getting 3 servings per day of protein, manipulating protein quality when you're already getting a sufficient total daily amount. I'm not saying these things wouldn't have an influence, but I'm saying that their influence is almost invariably trivial. And trivial is a statistical qualifying statement that we make based upon the Cohen's d family of effect sizes. But trivial is a different thing for someone who is trying to get in shape for the summer, someone who is trying to lower their blood pressure and doesn't want to lose too much lean mass for functionality, and someone who is trying to win WNBF Worlds next year. So it is a difficult and challenging proposition to make sure that your message meets the audience. And that's why in our paper, we tried to give that kind of matrix of risk and importance. And I think that's something you can do, or you can even set up in your own study, what is the smallest worthwhile difference of interest or the smallest effect size of interest? Because you could make the argument that, let's say we're doing a powerlifting study, and this is a total aside. Statistically, it might be that what is equivalent to a 10 kilogram change in a lift is the smallest effect size difference when you're dealing with some pretty strong people. But those pretty strong people, when they go to compete at IPF Worlds, if you tell them, it doesn't matter if you total 890 or 900, you're like, bro, that's the difference between me placing on the podium and placing 7th. Like, it does matter. So you could absolutely make the argument that the smallest effect size of interest in a powerlifting study is 2.5 kilograms, the smallest increment you can make when you're not breaking a record. And you could justify that. So it's a tough thing, Nick. I think there are certain bounds and guidance on each one of those variables. I think protein quality is probably a non-issue once you're consuming a sufficiently high intake in most cases. I think the threshold of protein frequency is probably not going to be any more beneficial if you're getting at least 3 evenly spread intakes. If you really wanted to hedge your bets based upon some acute data, you could say, hey, let me get a 4th one. The frequency and timing and distribution, there is some data to indicate like an intermittent fasting, traditional 8-hour feeding window is fine in the short term. But if you look at studies in a year or longer, you start to see slightly less lean mass accrual or just lean mass retention versus a traditional diet. So if someone is telling me I want to get leaner and I'm interested in fitness and I do better with an intermittent fasting approach, thumbs up, go for it. If someone is telling me I want to have a really successful off season and improve my powerlifting total next year, and I'm a lean 74 kilo lifter who hovers around their weight class, I'm going to say, 8-hour feeding window. I know it helps you with satiety, but I'm not sure you're going to be improving your bench press and squat as much if you're really not getting that many protein servings in a day and you're just kind of cramming it all in. We might be able to optimize your distribution. Is it going to be a large difference? No, but like I said, you might care about a 2.5 kilogram difference. So I hope that answers not only the direct question you asked me, but also kind of the meta question we have of, in some cases, I think research should be there to primarily give us conceptual answers to things and to help us understand the relationship between 2 variables. And then if we're looking for specific answers, the more variables we cram together and consider their interacting effects, by definition, the less likely we're able to give specific answers. So I can tell you kind of in a vacuum how protein quality, timing, frequency, or dose operates. And I'm pretty damn confident that higher protein intakes are better for muscle gain or retention, with kind of the description of that relationship that we talked about. But when you start to layer in these other moderators, I can't tell you like with like an Excel spreadsheet that popped out, well, when you go from 2 to 4 frequency, you'll have 10% more retention of lean mass. But I can tell you, like based upon each one of these individual relationships that we've looked at with an independent group of studies and separate analyses, here's probably where you want to land. And then how do we adapt that to your circumstance? And then just to make sure that the individual understands that there's noisiness around that has to do with your individual physiology, psychology, and environment. Because, we talked earlier about how a 500 calorie deficit is the point where you see lean mass retention, more than that, potentially lean mass loss, more than that or less than that lean mass gain. But included in that analysis are studies where you had people with obesity, close to 300 pounds, who are consuming 1,000 calories per day. So they're probably in a 2,000 calorie deficit and they're gaining lean tissue, right? Now, that isn't all of the studies in this analysis. There's 1,500 people in that Kohler and Murphy meta-regression. So they didn't influence that relationship enough to change that the average response was 500 kcal deficit, no change in lean mass. But the reality is you take a lean person who's well trained, not going to be making newbie gains, you could do everything right and they lose 5%, of their weight as lean mass. And you could take someone who has obesity, has never trained before, and they do a decent job in the gym twice per week for 45 minutes, and they're in a 2,000 calorie deficit and they maintain lean mass. It's not that they were doing something better than the other. It's just that we have very different factors that are unrelated to the dependent and independent variable which are influencing that outcome.
Well, Eric, I am satisfied with that answer, and it is my podcast, so that's really all that matters.
Amazing.
So thank you very much for your time and for your knowledge, as always. And are there any links that you want to leave people with that I can put in the show notes?
Absolutely. So the beauty of this study that we just talked about, it is open access, full text, and is as complicated as I made it sound. I think we did a pretty good job of writing about it so that you can understand this stuff, especially if you want to dig into some of the figures. We have some really nice infographics that are in this. It is open access. Everyone can read it. And also on my Instagram, we have a few posts that summarize these findings even further. So if you're interested in learning about this, definitely feel free to read the full text. If the results and the stats are a little kind of over your head, I think the introduction and discussion is a great place to start. I think those will be really helpful to people as a nice companion piece to me talking through some of these complexities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in, as always, and I shall talk to you next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.